Hello everyone, welcome to NDCPD's second collaborative webinar series. While we're waiting, please add your city and state in the chat so we can see where everybody's from. Welcome everyone to NDCPD's second collaborative webinar series. While we're waiting, for those of you, if you can add your city and state in the chat so we can see where you all are from. For those of you just joining, please put your city and state in the chat so we can see where everybody's from. Welcome to NDCPD's Collaboration for Change webinar series. We're so excited to be hosting this event again this year. Last year, we had sessions about disability trends, customized employment, and other disability-related topics, and we were excited to see so many people interested in take part this year. This year, we have a record number of registrations. For those of you who are familiar with NDCPD, awesome! For those of you who aren't, we're a University Center of Excellence on Developmental Disabilities, also known as a UCED, and we're part of a national network of 67 other UCEDs throughout the United States. We serve the North Dakota disability community by providing training, technical assistance, services, and information. We have approximately 15 to 20 projects at NDCPD that cover a range of topics connected to disabilities, employment, housing, education, and early intervention, to name a few. We're also excited to announce this is NDCPD's 35th anniversary. More to come on that throughout the year. You can check us out at www.ndcpd.org. Today is the first webinar in a series of 5. NDCPD is hosting today's event as an informational exchange on specific disability topics. With this event, we hope to build a community of individuals and agencies with a common interest in disabilities. We're excited for today's event and hope you enjoy today's presentation. We have a couple of housekeeping notes. We will be recording today's event, and the recordings will eventually be available on our website. We will have time at the end of today's session for Q&A for our presenter. To get your feedback on today's session, we will have a short online survey. The link for the survey will be in the chat at the end of today's session and also emailed to you after today's session. We will appreciate any feedback. You can get up to 5 contact hours, which will be available for social work or nursing, depending on how many sessions you attend. If you want contact hours, you must complete this online survey. As well, contact hours will only be granted to those who attend the live sessions. Watching the recordings after the fact will not count towards contact hours. This is different from last year. And with that, I believe we're ready to get things started. Today's webinar is titled Client Rights and Dignity of Risk. Today's presenter is Pam Mack from the North Dakota Protection and Advocacy. And now we will turn our attention over to our guest speaker. Welcome, Pam.
Thank you so much, NDCPD staff and those participating. I look forward to great interaction, and feel free to put questions in the chat or let me know if there's something that you would like to talk about further. But we look forward to having some time together. So we do have, I think, 2 things that we're going to talk about today, and it's the rights of people with disabilities, and then along with that, both their responsibilities and dignity of risk, and how that plays into that personal decision-making that comes into play. So I believe, Vanessa, are you folks going to display my PowerPoint, or do I need to do that?
I believe Krista is going to share your screen.
Perfect. While that's taking place, just a couple of things. There are really, I think, a wide variety of places that you will find the supporting documents for the rights of individuals with disabilities. And so the majority of it will be found in either your North Dakota Century Code or federal law regarding disability issues, or administrative code within North Dakota. So while we're going to talk in some generalities, all of the different supporting information can always be found in law or regulation. And so if you want more information about that, you're always welcome to contact me, but we will talk really in a general perspective about people with disabilities. So really, there's several different areas in which we'll talk about, and what does that mean for people with disabilities? So a right is really something that people are allowed to do or have all of the time. And that's very much like all of us. But what we do is we take those for granted. And they're things that we just know as adults we have the right to do. When we have people that have disabilities and they're dependent on caregivers or within facilities, oftentimes we begin to establish practices where we make limitations to those. And really, that should not be done, even if they have a guardian and someone that needs to support them with decision making, their rights are still theirs. And we need to be supporting that and ensuring that we protect those rights. So in that process, let's talk a little bit more about what is occurring with that. And for some odd reason, my slides are not advancing. Okay. So Vanessa, do I need to have you folks advance them?
I'll let Krista answer that.
Okay. I apologize for our.
You're fine. You're
Yeah,
just
could
fine.
you just let us know next slide?
Okay, you bet. So you can keep going. So when we talk about client rights, we also talk about what are the responsibilities that go along with that. And with that, you have the responsibility to ensure that you do the best that you can and that every choice that you make is within the law and that you're not going to be compromising someone else as a result of that, and that you aren't going to be in a situation by making a choice or a decision that is within your right will harm someone else. So when we talk about responsibilities, we'll talk a little bit more about that. So you can go on. So when we talk about client rights and someone lives within a facility or they're dependent on caregivers, there are times that there is a restriction. And that is when we look at how do we limit someone's rights or limit their ability to exercise them, because we need to ensure that people are safe, the environment is safe, that property is protected, and that we are looking at how do we support that person and recognize that they may be making decisions that are creating safety issues or challenges. And then we have to address that with their services and wrap around habilitation or teaching so that we can look at reinstating that right. So you can go on. So how can rights be restricted? Typically, when we talk about this, there's a care team, there's a plan that's been developed. It might be an outcome support plan, a treatment team plan, a care plan within a nursing facility. And so there's always that team. And you have to look then about whether that person with the disability is able to make their own decisions. And if so, are they consenting to that rights restriction? And if not, or even if they do, there's then a series of due process steps that you need to look at to ensure that it's the least restrictive. You're developing a plan for training and habilitation, and that you have a written plan to reinstate that right. There always does need to be a review process at least every 6 months or annually, depending on the type of facility or setting that you're in. And then that overall plan to reinstate that right so that the person can fully gain their ability to make their own decisions. You can move on. So in North Dakota, we do have what's called the Bill of Rights for people with developmental disabilities. And that is something that was established during the ARC lawsuit and federally when there was a need to look at protections. In our long-term care system, we do have administrative code, and that will very much mirror the DD Bill of Rights. And so that's just some of the different methods of finding supporting law or administrative code for individual rights. You can move on. So we all have the right to live, work, and play in the most normal way possible, or as we would if we're just living our own lives. But there is a responsibility with that to ensure that we're safe, that we're ensuring that people around us are safe, and that we're not being destructive of property or belongings of other people, because those are things when we start moving into that criminal world. And so that responsibility is to ensure that we're safe in the way that we exercise that right. You can move on. So there's two different ways in which an individual's rights can be changed by the system, and they may or may not then have full capability for decision making. So two formal processes within the state are called guardianship and supported decision making. So the first one, which is the least restrictive, is supported decision making. And that is a process where you retain all rights to make decisions, but you do identify that you may need some support in order to do that. And you can then designate someone specifically that you want to support you to make decisions. That is put into a written document, and it then is legally, I won't say binding, but recognized by banks, by healthcare institutions, by providers, that you're asking and establishing someone to help you make decisions. If in fact you lack capacity or that you are struggling to make decisions in your best interest, then we always do look at, again, what is the least restrictive, but then in that process, it then becomes a formal court process for guardianship. Now, guardianship can be limited, or it also can be full. And what that means is that the judge will determine in the 8 basic areas of personal decision making whether or not the person has the ability to retain that right for decision making, or is there going to be a guardian that is going to make those decisions. You also have an array of decision making where the judge may say this individual has the ability to make decisions with modest sums of money up to $100, but any financial decision making above that requires the input and the personal decision making of the guardian. And so guardianship documents can look very different, and it's important, if you're supporting people, to really understand, if they have a guardian, what rights did they retain and what rights does that guardian make. Guardianships in North Dakota are reviewed formally by the court every 5 years, and new orders are developed to address whether there's any changes or reinstatement of rights, or are there areas where the person has gained skills and can they then begin to make their own decisions. And in that case, the guardian always has the responsibility to ensure that they're making decisions in the best interest and well-being of the individual. And unfortunately, we do see that sometimes that doesn't happen, and that's when we have abuse, neglect, or exploitation that may occur, and those are things that P&A unfortunately sees quite a bit. So you can move on to the next slide. One of the things that's always addressed too within guardianship and or individual rights is the right to vote. And that is something that we're all afforded as citizens. And it's important to make sure that we're supporting people to know that they can vote, educating them on political issues, so that they can freely do that. There is wonderful assistive technology that's available if a person needs that support to vote independently. But that is something that is also addressed in the guardianship process. So you can have a guardian, but still retain the right to vote. And so that is a democracy thing that's promoted and supported for people, and that right can only be restricted by the court. Next slide. Religion and cultural practices is something that is becoming more and more prominent in the disability rights community. And one of the things that we often found many, many years ago, before we were looking at how do we support people, is they were not afforded that opportunity to really be educated and to practice their religion or to believe in what they choose to. Oftentimes they were at the mercy of what was the religion and or the cultural background of who was caring for them, and that dictated what they did. I know one case that PNA had several years ago is a guardian was of a religion that did not believe or did not promote blood transfusions. And there was an emergency surgery that was needed for this person's sister, and they were the guardian, and they were not consenting to that surgical procedure because it would need a blood transfusion. But that was actually not the religion of the sibling. And so PNA did intervene to ensure that the guardian's religion and wishes was not impacting that person's ability to seek health care. So we really need to make sure that we're looking at that, recognizing the cultural issues and religious beliefs of individuals and promoting what is important to them. So next slide. Having our own friends and spending time with people that are important to us. So much of what we need to be supporting people to have meaningful relationships, to have the right to have friends, to date, to have significant others, and that we're really recognizing what those preferences are for people, for themselves, and not who do we think they should be spending time with, and who do they choose versus who would we choose if we were making that decision for them. Now, again, with that, there's that responsibility of having good, positive relationships, being respectful, treating people nicely. And so those are sometimes things that we have to teach, because you may have someone that has social deficits or may not have a strong background of their growing up years in which they learned those things. And so we oftentimes need to promote that. If we're caring for people too, we need to create opportunities for them to spend time with their friends and engage with them in meaningful activities and things that they enjoy doing. So it's not just saying they have a friend, do they truly have a friendship? And how do we promote that? I know we all do that naturally, and I can't imagine if I didn't have that in my life, but sometimes people need support to be able to do that. Next slide. Confidentiality is something that is incredibly important in our disability community. And oftentimes we forget that we wouldn't want our personal information shared with others. And so the life of the people that we support and work with shouldn't be an open textbook. It is not something that we should be sharing information or releasing records. In the forefront now, we hear about health information and protected information in healthcare. We also hear FERPA, which is educational privacy rights. And so all of those things come into play to ensure that we are protecting the confidentiality of people and their records, and that they're only being released or shared with others, or people have the opportunity to see them if there's been that signed release of information and informed consent. And then the ability to withdraw that at any point in time. So next slide. I have the ability to choose what I wear every day. Um, my own clothes, have my own things, my personal possessions. And this is something that oftentimes, especially if people went into facilities or institutional placements, they were limited to what they were able to have. They couldn't have personal possessions within their rooms or their personal things. In essence, it became this was the institution or the facility, and we didn't think about what personal items were important to them. Along with that, though, we have to ensure that people know how to properly dress. Are we educating them to wear appropriate weather-related clothing? Lord knows in our weather we've had the last week. Multiple layers, coats, hats, boots. We've been freezing our fannies off. And so it's really important that we do that teaching and we make sure that people have the ability to do that and that they have the choice of what they wear within that capability to ensure that they're safe. We recently got a phone call from an entity, and they said, we have an individual that is absolutely refusing to put their coat on to go outside. What do we do? Well, make sure it's with them and keep promoting that, prompting that. And why is it? Do they not like that coat? Do they not like the color of it? Do they not like the material that it is? And so really explore the why and hopefully figure out how to mitigate that. But we have to have warm clothes in this North Dakota weather. The next one, the right to get and send mail. Um, this is an area that we don't see so much anymore because we don't see a lot of mail use. But I'm going to just give examples of how we extend that to electronic mail, email, letters, sending cards to people, and that others don't have the right to open that and read it unless they have permission from the person that is the recipient to receive it or send it. And so really promoting that and ensuring that it's extended to text messages, instant messages, Messenger and Facebook. So while the DD Bill of Rights really talks about paper mail, I want us to really expand that and think about how that's affected by the electronic world that we live in now and ensuring that we're careful about that. Next slide. And again, the use of phone. It can be a landline, it can be a cell phone, it can be a walkie-talkie, a smartwatch, any means of communication. We are not limiting and or ensuring that we're teaching and that there's access to it. But again, the person has the responsibility to ensure that they can afford that, they can pay for it, and that their personal funds allow for that. Next slide. The right to be paid a fair wage for the work that you do. This is something that in our state, we do have a lot of employers that are very good about paying minimum wage or above for individuals with disabilities, but we still do have processes within North Dakota for individuals with disabilities that allow for sub-minimum wage to be paid for jobs performed. And that is something that we're really trying to ensure we address and know that people are paid meaningful wages for the work that they do and that people aren't taking advantage of them and asking for work to be done and not having compensation. But again, that responsibility is if you agree to do a job, you need to go to work as scheduled and really make sure that you're performing the duties of your job. And Jeff, I'm going to say I agree with every bit of that. Time to end sub-minimum wage in North Dakota. We would love to see it go away. and really a recognition that people with disabilities deserve the technology and the supports to be able to level that playing field and to be paid a fair wage. And you'll always hear that from PNA. So definitely. Next slide. The right to spend my money as I want to and have support, but not restriction in personal decision making when it comes to paying bills. Now, we know that within our system, we do have what are representative payees that Social Security oftentimes will identify that a person needs in order to have support to budget and pay their bills and ensure that those essential bills are paid. And yet a rep payee does have a responsibility to ensure that people are provided with spending money, personal monies for things that they would like to spend money on and find that balance. So one of the programs that PNA does do is we go into organizational payees and conduct reviews to ensure that payees are managing beneficiary funds consistent with the regulations. And so it's one of those things that we do in order to ensure that we're protecting those rights. With that, we do provide education and training for payees. And so that's something that if you ever have an interest in, I am actually the project manager for that program, and you're more than welcome to contact me. The next slide talks a little bit about healthcare choices and the right to choose your physicians, your pharmacies, your healthcare. And if you don't like a physician, to go get a second opinion. We do that. We choose who is going to help us. And if we don't like a doctor, we don't stay there. So that is something that we always have the ability to support. But along with that, then you also have the responsibility to ensure that you're making good decisions, that you're following orders from the physician, you're taking your medication that's prescribed, and doing all of the necessary things to ensure that you're making good decisions regarding your health care. Along with that, the next slide talks about your ability to say no to changes that a provider may want to make with your medications. Or if you don't like how a medication feels, that you communicate to the doctor and you talk about the risk. So when we talk about dignity of risk, a lot of that is you have the ability to say no or to discuss with your physician changes to your medication. But there may be times that a physician is saying it's important for you to take this, or the consequences could be life-threatening. And those become really decisions that are tough with, is that a dignity of risk, or can they vocalize for me what's going to happen if they don't make good decisions? And do they truly understand the ramification of that? Probably one of the toughest areas to balance out that dignity of risk versus the responsibility and the right to make that decision. Stephanie, let's plan to visit about your concern that you put in the chat, and I'd be happy to visit with you further. So either you can reach out to me, or you can let NDCPD know if they can share your contact information with me. But I will definitely put my email address in the chat too before we end our session today, so people can contact me. Moving to the next slide, every individual with a disability has the right to be free from abuse, neglect, and exploitation, treated well, respected, and that someone's going to intervene if something is happening that shouldn't be. Along with that, you have the responsibility to ensure that you're also treating others respectfully. There are several organizations within the state that do abuse, neglect, and exploitation work and investigations. PNA is one of them. Vulnerable Adult Protective Services and Child Protection are two that we partner with routinely. So if you ever have concerns about A&E or abuse, neglect, and exploitation, you're always welcome to contact PNA. Some of the different areas that come into play with A&E, and so you can advance to the next slide for me, is the right to not be subjected to restrictions of your freedom of movement or restraints. If you're in a facility, there are prohibited procedures within administrative code and statute, and people always need to be supported in the least restrictive manner. Plans always need to address if there's going to be a situation where a person is not protected or supported with not being restrained or in any way secluded in any manner. And so those are things that we all have to be really careful of, especially if we're providing care to people. The next one really is something that we don't see often any longer, but it was something early on in the disability field that we're seeing a lot of brain surgeries or other medical procedures that were being done because it believed that it could mitigate the significant nature and or the effects of a disability. And so psychosurgery, sterilization, as you may recall, there was a period of time in the 70s and early 80s where every person that had a developmental disability was automatically sterilized because it was believed that they should not and did not deserve the right to bear children. And so all of those things are in statute now and protected, and there needs to be a court order before any of those procedures can be done any longer. Again, making good decisions is your responsibility and things that we need to think about. So the next slide, along with that, in the mental health field, we saw a lot of use of what was called electric shock therapy. And it was commonly used to address mental health issues because there was a clinical belief that it was beneficial and therapeutic. Now, there are limited, and I say that very cautiously, there are still very limited clinical benefits that a psychiatrist may recommend electric shock treatment. But there are protections. There's very controlled environments where that can be and should be done. And so things that we need to really think about with that to ensure that you have a physician that is educated and able to make those decisions. But you have the right to say no also. Next one. And I'm going to tell you that this is the area that we see from a disability rights perspective that guardians will make probably the most restrictive decisions without justification. And a person has the right to eat foods that they want and have access to them. It should not be locked. They shouldn't be restricted from purchasing it and or having it available to them. And that dignity of risk comes into play when we talk about, well, can they have 5 sodas a day? Can they eat that whole bag of potato chips? Well, their right says yes, they can. And so you really have to balance when you restrict that. And is it because it's just not healthy? Or is it truly life-threatening? And we will oftentimes say, a physician will say, well, this person needs to lose weight. My physician tells me probably would be a good idea, Pam, to lose some weight. But that doesn't mean people restrict my diet and people restrict what I eat. It's still my choice. And so even if you have a physician recommendation, you need to figure out how you're going to balance that and allow choices, but promote healthy living, support to follow a diet. How do we ensure that they're participating in grocery shopping and cooking, and that they have a balance between their choices and their rights and what is recommended? And how do we balance that? Do we promote more drinking water? Or do we kind of set up a system where they have a soda and they have water? And I know for myself, I really try to make sure that for every soda I drink, which I do have one right now, I have a glass of water, but that's my choice. And so those are things that we really have to help promote and balance, and sometimes teach guardians that they don't necessarily have the right to make all of the choices. They have to find a balance. So the next slide. Students with disabilities under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act do have the right to go to school and attend school if they would like to, up to the age of 21. Under federal law, both 504 and IDEA, we have responsibilities to ensure that people with disabilities are provided with the accommodations, modifications, specialized services, related services, and the support that they need to fully participate and benefit from their education. That is an area of work that PNA does a great or a large amount of work in. And if you ever need information, we can surely provide more. But just remember that students have the choice to participate up to the age of 21, but they don't have to either. So those are things just to keep in mind. Next slide. People that are in services have the ability to have a person-centered, organized planning meeting at least once a year, where we're looking at how are we going to promote independence, how are we going to ensure that their preferences and their skills that they would like to gain are being supported, and how do we ensure that the caregivers and the team members that are going to be carrying out those services are knowledgeable and able to do that, and ensure that all aspects of that are promoting and protecting the rights of people with disabilities. So definitely things that we need to think about. Our administrative code and our service delivery systems outline that person-centered planning process very carefully. So that is something that we all need to think about. Along with that, on the next slide, it'll talk about a person's ability to refuse services or stop them whenever they want to. And yet they do need to understand what are the risks associated with that. What will that mean for their ability to start them again if they choose to stop them? And then along with that, the provider or people that are involved in the person's life really do have the responsibility to ensure that they're promoting that choice, but that they have thoroughly educated the person on the risks associated with what will happen if they stop those services. And oftentimes, if they are choosing that and they're just demonstrating poor decision making, they may be engaging what we call self-neglect. And in those situations is when you may need to look at a limited guardianship or an alternative way to help support them to ensure that their needs are going to be met if they're choosing to not have services. And unfortunately, that is something that we tend to see at times, and they may deteriorate before we're able to get them back into services. And so just really kind of trying to look at how do we balance that, but yet support them if they truly are wanting to make that choice. Next slide. And just generally, in the democracy that we live in, people with disabilities have the same rights as any other person within our country. We have the responsibility to ensure that we're promoting that and that we are recognizing that enforcing or changing those rights can only be done by the courts. We need to teach people to respect others and to obey laws and help educate them on what that means. And that isn't always easy, but it's the ongoing responsibility that we have. So our next slide really is designed to recognize that if we're not happy about something, we do have the ability to seek outside entities to help hear our complaints, asking for help, asking for an advocate or someone to support us, because maybe there's a conflict within a team. And with that, we also want to ensure that people feel like they are being heard and that if they're voicing a concern, we're actively engaging in communication to address that. Oftentimes, dissatisfaction or conflict occurs just because people aren't feeling heard. Not that they aren't willing or make good decisions, but they don't feel heard. And so we really need to recognize that and take the time and make the effort to actively listen. Our next slide is everyone has the right to be treated with dignity and respect. Our responsibility is that we're role modeling that, we're treating people the way that we would like to be treated, and that we're just teaching and modeling respect. That is something that we're not always good at. We don't always even treat the people that are closest to us with the respect that they deserve. And so I challenge everyone to think about that, live that life, and really just, I heard someone say recently, why can't we just be kind to everyone? And if we could just be kind, life would be so much easier. So role model that as caregivers, as staff working in the field. The best way we can do that is to model it and do it ourselves. But that is a right that people with disabilities do have and deserve. Our next slide is just the right to have trained and competent staff. When our state and our federal government give funds to providers or caregivers, the responsibility that that agency has is to ensure that they're going to use that money as it's intended, that they're training staff, they're educating staff on client rights, people's rights, and how to provide that best support. And so one of the things that we recognize is that all of that staff training is such an important part of what we do. So there's a lot of training that PNA provides, and our staff trainers within providers also do a lot of great work. Our staff nurses have a great nursing association, and so look for opportunities for good training for staff. I see a question in the chat. Does PNA offer or deal with landlord mediation? We don't, but High Plains Fair Housing of the Dakotas does offer landlord tenant and landlord mediation. So that would be your best resource, Cody, for that issue. And that kind of goes with the next slide, is a right to live in a home that is clean and safe. And yet we know that if you are renting property, there are responsibilities that you need to take to maintain your home, ensure that you're keeping it clean and that you're adequately caring for and ensuring that your environment is being well cared for. So that's something that really kind of comes into how do we teach that? How do we promote that? How do we support that? And if the person is unable to do so, what can we do to help them with that? Or is it that they have a need to budget a cleaning lady in their monthly budget and ensure that they are looking at other ways for that to be done? And those are the same things that we would do. So if there's a rights restriction, our next slide, just things to think about. Ensure that the person and the guardian is aware of what that restriction is going to be. And if those rights are going to be restricted and you're in a provider system or a facility, a long-term care, skilled nursing facility, there is an approval process that needs to be followed in order for rights restrictions to be put in place. And then there always is a need to ensure that there's a plan to reinstate those rights. And so just some due process things to think about. And last slide, this is just a quote that I like from Roger Baldwin, who was the founder of ACLU. So long as we have enough people in this country that are willing to fight for their rights, we will be called a democracy, and so important in our day and age. So I see a couple of questions in the chat that I will address now, and then I'll open the floor for any other questions. How do we handle companies handling hiring staff with big communication barriers due to not speaking English and not being able to carry out certain tasks, which in return frustrates the client? I think those are challenges that we have right now in our system. And it is, what are we doing to provide opportunities for language translation, for training opportunities that can keep those things in mind? Are we doing more on-site mentoring and demonstrating cares versus relying on a person reading a plan? And so it really does become a very individualized challenge that providers have. But I do think that we are going to continue to see more of that within our workforce. And so it's one of those challenges that we have to figure out how to rise to and think about. I do know that a number of organizations, including NDCPD, have been exploring and expanding training mechanisms to be able to adequately provide some of that support. But it is definitely a challenge. The staff trainers across the state continue to look at options and methods of meeting those training needs. And so just keep those things in mind. But it is something that we are going to have to continue to challenge ourselves, as a lot of our individuals that are receiving services have different language needs. We need to accommodate that. If an entity is violating the Bill of Rights, is it P&A that should be contacted? We can be, absolutely. But I would also look at, is that being done within an organization or a facility, and utilizing the internal processes that are present, and really looking at what are policies and procedures that are established in that service delivery system, because that will identify whether or not adequate steps for due process have been taken, and has it been put into a formal plan, and what do we need to do about that. So just some thoughts about what to do. But yes, you can always call P&A centralized intake and have a conversation about that, and determine if it's something that fits within abuse, neglect, and exploitation, or do we have recommendations for you to address that within the provider or the facility. And so those are things that we'll talk through with you. So other questions?
I think Lisa has her hand raised here. Pam, if you want to, Lisa, if you want to ask your question.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I'm sorry. Yes, my name is Lisa, and I work in a healthcare setting. And I'm going to piggyback a little bit off of Stephanie with regards to rep payees. We often, number one, will get complaints like Stephanie mentioned, but also we will get requests from patients kind of pointed towards their providers about how they can stop having a rep payee and looking for support. So our providers tend to shy away from that a little bit since it's the financial area, but I do know, like Social Security, I believe they do look to healthcare providers to comment on that. So, Pam, in those situations, would we be able to point them to protection and advocacy to kind of review their concerns, maybe look at mediation if needed, and or maybe helping them connect with Social Security to try to see whether they would be able to become their own responsible for their own finances again?
That would not be an area of rights that PNA would probably get involved with, because typically we would see that falling within the purview of the provider that is providing the services to be able to help support. Procedurally, the first step, if a person wants to be their own payee, is Social Security would require a physician to state and identify that that person has the capability to make decisions. Now, one of the things that we do find is typically a family physician may not feel comfortable making that recommendation. And so oftentimes we will see an individual do like a psychological assessment or evaluation or a neuropsych, where they can delve into some of that ability to make decisions and that problem solving, and do they understand the concepts of money. And then if you have someone that can say and verify from a healthcare decision-making capacity that they are able to make that decision, then that can be taken to Social Security and provided to them if in fact that healthcare provider says the person can adequately manage their own money. If you don't have that written physician's order, Social Security is not going to touch it. They don't. Their threshold is pretty significant, and they see it as a protection versus a restriction. And a good rep payee can operate in that manner. I'm going to just make sure that your essential bills are paid. This is your budget. This is what it is. And then I'm going to give you your spending money. And then how do you have support to manage that spending money? So centers for independent living across the state are really good resources. If people want to become their own payee, that's where we would have you go, is the SILs.
Okay, thank you. And that does confirm, my understanding of the process. I think the hard part is they don't always agree, right? The individuals. But you are saying if someone has a dispute or a complaint about a rep payee, that, maybe they're abusing, there's maybe some exploitation going on, then we would go through like a VAPS report
or a report to PNA.
Yeah, okay. All right.
Yep.
Thank you.
There are questions, folks.
Krista, you've got your hand raised.
Yeah, do you have any resources for obtaining like true informed consent? I was recently asked for some advice on how to approach a situation where somebody was getting a new roommate and that person did not have any environmental restrictions in their apartment, but the new roommate needed some appliances locked up. And when the behavior specialist asked the person if they were okay with it, they said yes. But when the person who actually had to implement the restrictions came in to do it, the person was really, really upset. And so my first thought was, I think that there was a power imbalance by the behavior specialist who asked for the consent, and the person probably didn't feel like they could say no to this person. So yeah, just any resources on obtaining informed consent and making sure that people are comfortable saying no, that would be really helpful, I think.
Krista, we do have information on informed consent so that we do have that available. What I would also offer in that situation is I would make a referral to P&A and our assistive technology project, because there are some really good AT devices that can be used on that refrigerator or cabinet, so that it's locked for the person who needs to have the restriction, but unlocked for the person that doesn't. And so there's some good environmental controls that can allow for that decision making. And it sounds like the team may just need some education on what would be available to allow for the freedom of rights for the person that doesn't need it and that restriction for the person that does. So if you want to contact me, you're welcome to do so. And before I forget, I am going to put my so I put my name and my email address in the chat, so everyone should have it now. You're welcome to either give me a call. Our main line is on our website, and I believe one of the NDCPD gals put our website in the chat earlier. It's www.ndpanda.org. So you're welcome to email me or call our centralized intake staff. They're all great resources. I supervise them. And so if you need assistance, you can call intake, and if they need to bring me in, they surely will do so.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Pam, so much for that great presentation. And thank you to everyone for the great questions. And thank you for attending today's webinar. We hope you enjoyed today's content. We'd appreciate your feedback via that online survey, which I believe will be going in the chat. Certificates of attendance will be emailed to all participants who complete the survey. Certificates will be issued within a week after each session. And once again, thank you so much for the participation today. The series is off to a really great start. Be sure to join us again next week. We'll have Dr. Tamar Heller from the USED in Illinois talks to us about aging in place. Stay in touch with NDCPD by liking us on Facebook or checking out our website. Have a great rest of your week, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.